In the meantime, Almagro landed with 200 soldiers. There had been set aside for him and his men, with what regrets may easily be imagined, 100,000 pesos, a Spanish coin. A fifth was reserved for the king, and this left 1,528,500 pesos to be divided between Pizarro and his companions. This product of pillage and massacre was solemnly divided between those entitled to it on the festival of St. James, the patron saint of Spain, after fervent prayer to God. A deplorable mixture, this of religion and profanity, too common, unfortunately, in these times of mingled superstition and avarice. Each horse soldier received pesos as his share, and each foot soldier 4,000, which would be equivalent to about 1,600 annal sterling. This was enough to satisfy the most exacting soldier, after a campaign which had been neither long nor difficult. Many of the adventurers wished to enjoy this unexpected good fortune in a peaceable manner in their own country, and eagerly asked for their dismissal. This Pizarro granted without hesitation, for he felt sure that the news of their rapidly acquired wealth would soon bring him new recruits. With his brother Ferdinand, who went to Spain to give the emperor an account of Pizarro's triumph and some splendid presents, went 60 Spaniards, laden heavily indeed with money, but lightly with remorse. As soon as Atahualpa's ransom was paid, he claimed his freedom. But Pizarro, who had only saved his life that he might make all the treasures of Peru his own, and shelter himself under the prestige and authority which the Inca still exercised over his subjects, was soon wearied by his entreaties. He suspected him also of having for some time secretly given orders to levy troops in the distant provinces of the empire. Besides, Atahualpa, having soon discovered that Pizarro was no better educated than one of the lowest of his soldiers, felt in consequence a contempt for the governor which, unfortunately, he could not conceal. Such were the reasons, all trivial as they were, which determined Pizarro to prepare for the trial of the Inca. Nothing could have been more hateful than this trial, in which Almagro and Pizarro were at the same time both suitors and judges. The heads of the accusation were so ridiculous and absurd that one is in doubt whether to be most surprised by the effrontery or the wickedness of Pizarro in subjecting the head of a powerful empire, over which he had no jurisdiction, to such an inquiry. Atahualpa, being found guilty, was condemned to be burnt alive, but as he had at length asked to be baptized, that he might rid himself of the importunities of Valverde, his enemies contented themselves with strangling him. A worthy counterpart this, of Guatemozin's execution. These were amongst the most atrocious and odious deeds committed by the Spaniards in America, where, however, they have sullied themselves with every imaginable crime. Among this herd of adventurers, there were still some men who had retained sentiments of honor and self-respect. They protested loudly against this perversion of justice, but their generous pleadings were stifled by the selfish declamations of Pizarro and his worthy assistants. The governor now raised one of Atahualpa's sons to the throne, under the name of Paul Inca, but the civil war between the two brothers and the events which had occurred since the arrival of the Spaniards had done much to loosen the ties which bound the Peruvians to their kings, and this young man, destined soon to die an ignominious death, had scarcely more authority than Manco Capac, the son of Huascar, who was acknowledged by the inhabitants of Cusco. Soon after this, some of the principal people in the country even tried to carve for themselves kingdoms out of the Empire of Peru. Such was Ruminagui, the commandant of Quito, who caused the brother and the children of Atahualpa to be massacred and declared himself independent. Discord reigned in the Peruvian camp, and the Spaniards resolved to take advantage of it. Pizarro advanced rapidly upon Cusco, the small number of his forces having been the only reason which had prevented him from doing so sooner. Now that a crowd of adventurers, attracted by the treasures which had been brought back to Panama, vied with each other in hastening to Peru, now that he could assemble 500 men, after leaving an important garrison at San Miguel under Benalcazar's command, Pizarro had no further reason for delay. On the way some skirmishes took place with large bodies of troops, but they ended, as always, with severe loss to the natives and a very insignificant one to the Spaniards. When they entered Cusco and took possession of the town, the invaders showed surprise at the small quantity of gold and precious stones which they found there, although it far exceeded Atahualpa's ransom. Was this because they were becoming accustomed to the riches of the country, or because there was a larger number to share in them. Meanwhile, Benalcázar, being weary of inaction, took advantage of the arrival of a reinforcement from Nicaragua and Panama to set out for Quito, where, according to the Peruvians, Atahualpa had left the greater part of his treasure. He placed himself at the head of 80 horse soldiers and infantry, defeated on several occasions Ruminagui, who disputed his passage, and thanks to his prudence and cleverness, he entered Quito victorious. But he did not find there what he sought, that is to say, the treasures of Atahualpa. At the same time, Peter d'Alvarado, who had so signally distinguished himself under Cortés, and who had been made governor of Guatemala as a reward for his services, pretended to believe that the province of Quito was not included in Pizarro's command, and organized an expedition consisting of 500 men, 200 of whom were cavalry. Landing at Porto Viejo, he wished to reach Quito without a guide, by going up the Guayaquil River and crossing the Andes. This road has always been one of the worst and most trying that it is possible to choose. Before they had reached the plain of Quito, after horrible sufferings from hunger and thirst, without speaking of the burning cinders hurled from the crater of Chimborazo, a volcano near Quito, and the snowstorms which assailed them, the fifth part of the band of adventurers and half the horses had perished. The remainder were completely discouraged and quite unfit for fighting. It was therefore with the greatest surprise and some uneasiness that they found themselves face to face, not with a body of Indians as they had expected, but with a party of Spaniards under the command of Almagro. The latter were preparing to charge, when some of the more moderate among the officers caused an arrangement to be entered into, by virtue of which Alvarado was to withdraw to his own province after receiving 100,000 pesos to defray the expenses of the armament. Ferdinand Pizarro had set sail for Spain, while these events were happening in Peru, feeling sure that the immense quantity of gold, silver, and precious stones which he took with him would secure him a warm welcome. He obtained for his brother Francisco the confirmation of his appointment as governor, with more extended powers. He himself was made a Knight of the Order of St. Diego. As for Almagro, he was confirmed in his title of Adelantado, and his jurisdiction was extend miles, without, however, its limits being very strictly defined, which left the door open for many contests and all kinds of arbitrary interpretations. Ferdinand Pizarro had not reached Peru again, when Almagro, having learnt that a special government had been assigned to him, pretended that Cusco formed part of it, and made preparations for its conquest. But Juan and Gonzalo Pizarro had no intention of allowing themselves to be robbed, and the parties were on the point of coming to blows when Francisco Pizarro, who is often called the Marquis or the Great Marquis, arrived at the capital. Almagro had never forgiven Francisco Pizarro the duplicity which he had displayed in his negotiations with Charles V, nor the coolness with which he had claimed for himself, at the expense of his two friends, the principal share of authority and the most extended government. But as Almagro met with great opposition to his designs, and as he was not the stronger, he concealed his vexation, put a good face on the matter, and seemed delighted at a reconciliation. They renewed their partnership, therefore, says Zarat, on condition that Don Diego d'Almagro should go and discover the country on the south side, and if he found any that was really good, they should ask his Majesty to make him the governor of it, but that if he found nothing to suit him, they should share Don Francisco's government between them. This arrangement was made very solemnly, and they took their oath upon the consecrated wafer, that for the future they would undertake nothing against one another. Some say that Almagro swore that he would never encroach either upon Cusco or on the surrounding country within 390 miles, even if his Majesty should give him the government of it. They add that turning towards the Holy Sacrament, he pronounced these words, "Lord, if I violate the oath that I now take, I pray that thou wilt confound me and punish me both in my body and my soul." Pizarro and Almagro take an oath upon the host. Pizarro and Almagro take an oath upon the host. After this solemn agreement, which was destined to be observed with as little fidelity as the first, Almagro made his preparations for departure. Thanks to his well-known liberality, as much as to his reputation for courage, he gathered together 570 men, of about equal numbers of cavalry and infantry, with which he set out by land for Chile. The journey was an extremely trying one, and the adventurers suffered severely from intense cold whilst crossing the Andes. They had also to deal with very warlike tribes, unsoftened by any civilization, who assailed them with a fury of which nothing they had seen in Peru had given them any idea. Almagro could make no settlement, for he had scarcely been 2 months in the country when he heard that the Indians in Peru had revolted and massacred the greater part of the Spaniards, whereupon he immediately retraced his steps. After the new partnership had been signed between the conquerors, 1534, Pizarro had returned to the provinces bordering on the sea, in which he could establish a regular government, there being no longer anything to dread from resistance. For a man who had never studied legislation, he had drawn up some very wise rules for the administration of justice, for the collection of taxes, the apportionment of the Indians, and the working of the mines. Some parts of the conquistador's character were doubtless very open to criticism, but it is only just to recognize that he was not wanting in enlarged ideas, and that he was conscientious in playing his part as the founder of a great empire. This it was which made him hesitate long before choosing the future capital of the Spanish possessions. Cusco had the recommendation of having been the residence of the Incas, but this town, situated more than 400 miles from the sea, was very distant from Quito, of which the importance seemed to Pizarro to be extreme. Before long he was struck with the beauty and fertility of a great valley, watered by a stream called the Rimac, and there in 1536 he established the seat of his dominion. Soon, the City of Kings, de los Reyes, or Lima, as it is called by a corruption of the name of the river which flows at its feet, assumed the aspect of a great city, owing to the magnificent palace and the sumptuous residences for officers, which Pizarro caused to be built there. While these cares kept Pizarro far from his capital, small bodies of troops, sent in different directions, penetrated into the most distant provinces of the empire, with the object of extinguishing the last smoldering embers of resistance. So many of the soldiers were employed in this way that there remained in Cusco itself but a very small body of troops. The Inca, who had remained in the hands of the Spaniards, thought this an opportune moment for fomenting a general rising, in which he earnestly hoped that the foreign government might be overthrown. Although closely guarded, he contrived to take his measures with so much skill that he did not arouse the suspicions of his oppressors. He obtained permission even to be present at a grand fete, which was to be held at several miles' distance from Cusco, and for which the most distinguished persons in the empire had met together. As soon as the Inca appeared, the standard of revolt was raised. The country was soon in arms, from the confines of the province of Quito as far as Chile, and a number of small detachments of Spaniards were surprised and destroyed. Cusco, defended by the three brothers Pizarro with but 170 Spaniards, was exposed for 8 consecutive months to the incessant attacks of the Peruvians, who had now become expert in the use of the arms which they had taken from their enemies. The conquerors made a most valiant resistance, but experienced some severe losses, especially that of Juan Pizarro. Almagro left Chile in the greatest haste, crossed the stony and sandy desert of Atacama, where he suffered as severely from heat and drought as he had done in the Andes from cold and snow, penetrated into the Peruvian territory, defeated Manco Capac in a great battle, and succeeded in approaching the town of Cusco after having driven away the Indians. He then tried to get the town given up to him, on the pretext that it was not included in Pizarro's government, and violating a truce during which the followers of the Marquis were taking a short rest. He entered Cusco, seized both Ferdinand and Gonzalo Pizarro, and had himself acknowledged as governor. While this was going on, a considerable body of Indians invested Lima, intercepted all communications, and annihilated the various small bodies of troops which Pizarro sent at intervals to the aid of the Spaniards at Cusco. At this time he sent away all his vessels to Panama to compel his companions to make a desperate resistance. He recalled from Truxillo the forces under the command of Alonso d'Alvarado, and entrusted to the latter a column of 500 men, which advanced to within several miles of the capital without having the slightest suspicion that the town was now in the hands of fellow countrymen, who were fully determined to bar their passage. But Almagro desired much rather to attract these new adversaries to himself than to destroy them. He arranged, therefore, to surprise them and make them prisoners. He had now a fine opportunity in his hands of ending the war and making himself master of the two governments by a single blow. Several of his officers had observed this to him, and especially Orgonos, who proposed that the two brothers of the conquistador should be put to death, and that Almagro should advance by forced marches with his victorious troops against Lima, where Pizarro, taken by surprise, would not be able to resist him. But as a Latin poet says, Jupiter makes dotards of those whom he means to ruin. Almagro, who in so many other instances had thrown aside all scruples, did not wish to put himself in the wrong by invading Pizarro's dominions as a rebel, and he quietly took the road back to Cusco. Looking at it only from the side of Almagro's own interests, he evidently committed in this a gross blunder, of which he was soon to repent. But if we consider, what we should never lose sight of, the interest of the country, he had already committed a capital crime in the acts of aggression of which he had been guilty, and in kindling civil war in face of an enemy quite ready to take advantage of it. His adversaries did not delay to remind him of it. Whereas prompt decision would have been necessary for Almagro to make him master of the situation, Pizarro had everything to expect from time and opportunity. While waiting for the promised reinforcements from Darien, he commenced negotiations with his adversary, lasting for several months, during which time one of his brothers, as well as Alvarado, found means to escape with more than 70 men. Although Almagro had been so often duped, he consented again to receive the licentiate Espinosa, who was ordered to represent to him that if the emperor knew what was taking place between the two competitors and learnt the condition to which their contests had reduced affairs, no doubt he would recall them both and put someone else in their place. At last, after the death of Espinosa, it was decided by the friar Francisco de Bobadilla, to whom Pizarro and Almagro had referred their differences, that Ferdinand Pizarro should be immediately set free, that Cusco should be given back to the Marquis, and that they should send several officers on both sides to Spain, charged with representing the respective rights of the two parties and submitting them to the emperor's decision. Scarcely had the last of his brothers been set at liberty than Pizarro, rejecting all idea of peace and amicable arrangement, declared that arms alone should decide whether he or Almagro was to be lord of Peru. In a short time, he had assembled a body of 700 men, of which he entrusted the command to his two brothers. Finding it impossible to cross the mountains which would have been the most direct road to Cusco, they followed the line of the sea-coast as far as Nazca, and then penetrated into a branch of the Andes, by which they could reach the capital in a short time. Possibly Almagro ought to have defended the mountain defiles, but he had only 500 men, and he reckoned much on his splendid cavalry, whom he could not deploy in a confined space. He therefore waited for the enemy in the plain of Cusco. The two parties encountered each other on the 26th of April, 1538, with equal animosity, but the victory was decided by 2 companies of musketeers, which the emperor had sent to Pizarro when he heard of the revolt of the Indians. 140 soldiers perished in this engagement, which received the name of Las Salinas. Orgonos and several officers of distinction were killed in cold blood after the battle, and Almagro himself, aged and ill, could not escape from Pizarro. The Indians who, assembled in arms on the surrounding mountains, had reckoned upon falling on the conqueror, had need instead to fly in all haste. Nothing, says Robertson, more entirely proves the ascendancy gained by the Spaniards over the Americans, than seeing that the latter, witnesses of the defeat and dispersion of one of the parties, had not the courage to attack the other, even weakened and fatigued as they were by their victory, and dared not fall upon their oppressors when fortune offered them so favorable an opportunity for attacking them with advantage. At this period, a victory not followed by pillage was incomplete, so the town of Cusco was sacked, and all the riches that Pizarro's companions found there did not suffice to content them. They had such exalted ideas of their merits and of the services which they had rendered, that each would have desired an appointment as governor. Ferdinand Pizarro therefore dispersed them and sent them to conquer fresh territories with some of the partisans of Almagro who had rallied, and whom it was important to send to a distance. As for Almagro himself, Ferdinand Pizarro, feeling convinced that his name constituted a focus of permanent agitation, resolved to get rid of him. He caused him therefore to be put upon his trial, which ended, as it was easy to foresee, in a sentence of death. When Almagro received this news, after giving way for a few moments to a very natural grief, pleading his great age and the different way in which he had behaved with regard to Ferdinand and Gonzalo Pizarro when they were his prisoners, he recovered his calmness and awaited his death with a soldier's courage. He was strangled in his prison and afterwards publicly beheaded, 1538. After several successful expeditions, Ferdinand Pizarro set out for Spain to give the emperor an account of what had taken place. He found most minds there strangely prejudiced against him and his brothers. Their cruelty, their violence, and their disregard of the most sacred engagements had been laid bare without reserve by some friends of Almagro's. Ferdinand Pizarro needed the utmost cleverness to win the emperor round. Charles had no means of judging fairly on which side the justice of the case lay, for he had only heard of it from the interested parties. He could only discern the deplorable consequences to his own government of the Civil War. He decided, therefore, to send a commissioner to the country, to whom he gave most extensive powers, and who, after having inquired into all that had taken place, should establish whatever form of government he thought most advisable. This delicate mission was confided to Cristobal de Vaca, a judge of audience at Valladolid, who proved not unequal to his task. One fact is worthy of notice. He was recommended to show the greatest respect towards Francisco Pizarro at the very time when his brother Ferdinand was arrested and thrown into a prison where he was destined to remain forgotten for 20 years. While these events were taking place in Spain, the Marquis portioned out the conquered country, keeping for himself and his trustworthy friends the most fertile and best-situated districts, and giving to Almagro's companions, the men of Chile as they were called, only the more sterile and distant territories. Next, he confided to Pedro de Valdivia, one of his aide-de-camp, the execution of the project which Almagro had only been able to sketch out, the conquest of Chile. Valdivia set out on the 28th of January, 1540, with 150 Spaniards, amongst whom Pedro Gomez, Pedro de Miranda, and Alonso de Monray were destined especially to distinguish themselves. He crossed first the desert of Atacama, which even at the present day is considered a most troublesome enterprise, and reached Copiapo, standing in the midst of a beautiful valley. Received at first with great cordiality, he had to sustain, as soon as harvest was over, several combats with the Araucanians, a race of brave, indefatigable warriors, very different from the Indians of Peru. In spite of this, he laid the foundations of the town of Santiago on the 12th of February, 1541. Valdivia spent 8 years in Chile, presiding over the conquest and organization of the country. Less greedy than the other conquistadores, his contemporaries, he only sought for the mineral riches of the country that he might ensure the development of the prosperity of his colony, in which he had taken care first of all to encourage agriculture. The best mine that I know of is one of corn and wine with nourishment for livestock. Who has this has money. As for mines, we do not depend upon them for subsistence, and often that which looks well outwardly is not really worth much. These wise words of Lescarbot, in his Histoire de la Nouvelle France, might have been used by Valdivia, so exactly do they correspond with and express his sentiments. His valor, prudence, and humanity, more especially the latter quality, which shines forth strangely in contrast with the cruelty of Pizarro, ensures for him a distinction all his own among the conquistadores of the 16th century. The shores of Rio Napo. The shores of Rio Napo. At the time that Valdivia set out for Chile, Gonzalo Pizarro crossed the Andes at the head of 340 Spaniards, half of whom were mounted, and Indians, of whom the greater part of the Indians perished from cold. Then he penetrated eastwards into the interior, seeking for a country where spices and cinnamon were said to abound. In these vast savannas, intersected by marshes and virgin forests, the Spaniards encountered torrents of rain, which lasted quite 2 months. They found only a scattered population, who were not industrious and also hostile. In consequence, the invaders often suffered from hunger in a country where there were then neither horses nor oxen, where the largest quadrupeds were tapirs and llamas, and even the latter were seldom met with on this slope of the Andes. In spite of these difficulties, which would have discouraged any less energetic explorers than the discoveradors of the 16th century, they persevered in their attempt and descended the Rio Napo or Coca, an affluent on the left of the Marañón, as far as its confluence. There, with great difficulty, they built a brigantine, which was manned by 50 soldiers under the command of Francisco Orellana. But either the strength of the current carried him away, or else being no longer under the eyes of his chief, he wished in his turn to be the leader of an expedition of discovery. He did not wait for Gonzalo Pizarro at the appointed rendezvous, but continued to descend the river until he reached the ocean. Such a voyage is simply marvelous, through nearly 6,000 miles of an unknown region, without guide, without compass, without provisions, with a crew who murmured more than once against the foolish attempt of their leader, and in the midst of populations almost invariably hostile. From the mouth of the river, which he had just descended in his badly built and dilapidated vessel, Orellana succeeded in reaching the island of Cubagua, whence he set sail for Spain. If the proverb, "He who comes from a distance tells many lies," were not of much earlier date, one might have thought it had been coined for Orellana. He invented the most preposterous fables as to the wealth of the countries he had traversed. The inhabitants were so rich that the roofs of the temples were formed of plates of gold, an assertion which gave rise to the legend of El Dorado. Orellana had heard of the existence of a republic of female warriors who had founded a vast empire, which caused the river Marañón to be called the River of the Amazons. If, however, we strip this narrative of all that is ridiculous and grotesque, and calculated to please the imaginations of his contemporaries, it remains certain that Orellana's expedition is one of the most remarkable of this epoch, so fertile in gigantic enterprises, and it furnishes the first information upon the immense zone of country lying between the Andes and the Atlantic. We must return to Gonzalo Pizarro. His embarrassment and consternation had been great when, on arriving at the confluence of the Napo and Marañón, he had not found Orellana, who was to have been awaiting him. Fearing that some accident might have befallen his lieutenant, he had descended the course of the river for 150 miles, until he met with an unfortunate officer who had been left behind for having addressed some remonstrances to his chief upon his perfidy. The bravest among Pizarro's men were discouraged at the news of the cowardly way in which they had been abandoned, and at the destitute condition in which they were left. Pizarro was obliged to yield to their entreaties and to return to Quito, from which they were more than 1,200 miles away. To give an idea of their sufferings on this return journey, it suffices to say that, after having eaten horses, dogs and reptiles, roots and wild beasts, and after having devoured every article made of leather in their accoutrements, the unfortunate survivors who reached Quito, lacerated by brambles, emaciated and utterly impoverished, numbered only 24. 4,000 Indians and 210 Spaniards had perished in this expedition, which had lasted less than 2 years. While Gonzalo Pizarro was conducting the unfortunate expedition just related, the old partisans of Almagro, who had never frankly joined Pizarro, gathered round the son of their old leader and formed a plot for murdering the Marquis. In vain was Francisco Pizarro several times warned of what was threatening him. He would pay no heed to the report. He said, "Keep quiet. I shall be safe as long as there is no one in Peru who does not know that I can in a moment take the life of anyone who should dare to form the project of attempting mine." On Sunday, the 26th of June, 1541, at the hour of siesta, Juan de Herrada and 18 conspirators left the house of Almagro's son with drawn swords in their hands and armed from top to toe. They ran towards the house of Pizarro, crying out, "Death to the tyrant! Death to the infamous wretch!" They entered the palace, killed Francisco de Chaves, who had appeared in haste on hearing the noise, and gained the hall where was Francisco Pizarro, with his brother Francisco Martin, the doctor Juan Velázquez, and a dozen servants. These jumped out of the windows, with the exception of Martin Pizarro, 2 other gentlemen, and 2 tall pages, who were killed while defending the door of the governor's apartment. He himself had not had time to put on his cuirass, but he seized his sword and buckler and defended himself valiantly, killing 4 of his adversaries and wounding several others. One of his assailants, in a spirit of self-devotion, attracted to himself the blows of Pizarro. Meanwhile, the other conspirators made their way in and attacked him with such fury that he could not parry all the blows, being so exhausted that he could scarcely wield his sword. Thus, says Zarat, they made an end and succeeded in killing him by a thrust in the throat. Falling to the ground, he asked in a loud voice that he might be allowed to confess, and then not being able any longer to speak, he made the sign of the cross on the ground, which he kissed, and then yielded up his soul to God. Some Negroes carried his body to the church, where Juan Barbazan, his old servant, alone ventured to come and claim it. This faithful servant secretly rendered to it funeral honors, for the conspirators had pillaged the house of Pizarro, not leaving enough even to pay for wax tapers. Death of Pizarro. Death of Pizarro. From an old print. Thus did Francisco Pizarro come to his end, assassinated even in the capital of the vast empire which Spain owed to his valor and indefatigable perseverance, but which he bestowed upon his country, it must be admitted, ravaged, decimated, and drowned in a deluge of blood. Pizarro is often compared with Cortés. The one had as much ambition, courage, and military capacity as the other, but the cruelty and avarice of the Marquis de Laval were carried to an extreme in Pizarro and united in him to perfidy and duplicity. If we are inclined to excuse certain parts of Cortés' character which are not estimable, by the times in which he lived, we are at least charmed by that grace and nobility of manners, and by that way of a gentleman above prejudices, which made him so much beloved by the soldier. In Pizarro, on the contrary, we find roughness and a harsh, unsympathizing way of feeling, while his chivalrous qualities disappear entirely behind the rapacity and perfidy which are the salient features of his character. If Cortés found brave and resolute adversaries among the Mexicans, who opposed almost insurmountable difficulties to his progress, Pizarro had no trouble in vanquishing the Peruvians, who were timid and enervated, and who never made any serious resistance to his arms. Of the conquests of Peru and Mexico, the less difficult produced the greater metallurgic advantage to Spain, and thus it was the more appreciated. The Civil War was on the point of breaking out again after Pizarro's death when the governor arrived, who was delegated by the metropolitan government. As soon as he had collected the needful troops, he marched towards Cusco. He seized young Almagro without trouble, had him beheaded with 40 of his confederates, and governed the country with firmness until the Viceroy Blasco Núñez Vila arrived. It is not our intention to enter into the detail of the disputes which took place between the latter and Gonzalo Pizarro, who, profiting by the general discontent caused by the new regulations as to the repartimientos, revolted against the emperor's representative. After many changes of fortune, for which we have not space, the struggle ended by the defeat and execution of Gonzalo Pizarro, which took place in 1548. His body was taken to Cusco and buried fully dressed, no one, says Garcilaso de la Vega, being willing to give even a winding sheet for it. Thus ended the judicial assassin of Almagro. Is not the text appropriate in this case? They that take the sword shall perish with the sword. Chapter 2. The First Voyage Round the World. Magellan, his early history, his disappointment, his change of nationality, preparations for the expedition, Rio de Janeiro, St. Julian's Bay, revolt of a part of the squadron, terrible punishment of the guilty, Magellan's Strait, Patagonia, the Pacific, the Ladrone Islands, Cebu and the Philippine Islands, death of Magellan, Borneo, the Moluccas and their productions, separation of the Trinidad and Victoria, return to Europe by the Cape of Good Hope, last misadventures. No one as yet was aware of the immense size of the continent discovered by Christopher Columbus. Still was sought perseveringly on the coast of America, which was thought to be a collection of several islands, the famous strait which should lead at once to the Pacific Ocean and to those Spice Islands, the possession of which would have made the fortune of Spain. While Cortereal and Cabot were seeking for it in the Atlantic Ocean, and Cortés in the furthest part of the Gulf of California, while Pizarro was coasting along Peru and Valdivia was conquering Chile, The solution of this problem was found by a Portuguese in the service of Spain, Ferdinand de Magellan. The son of a gentleman of Ceuta y Armas, Ferdinand de Magellan was born either at Oporto, at Lisbon, at Villa de Sabrosa, or at Villa de Figueiro. It is not actually known which. The date of his birth is unknown, but it took place towards the end of the 15th century. He had been brought up in the house of King John Roman II, where he received as complete an education as could then be given him. After having made mathematics and navigation his special study, for at this time in Portugal there was an irresistible current which drew the whole country towards maritime expeditions and discoveries, Magellan early embraced a maritime career and embarked in 1505 with Almeida, who was on his way to the Indies. He took part in the sacking of Quiloa and in all the events of that campaign. The following year he accompanied Vaz Pereira to Sofala. Then, on returning to the Malabar coast, we find him assisting Albuquerque at the taking of Malacca and bearing himself on that occasion with equal prudence and bravery. He took part in the expedition sent by Albuquerque about 1510 to seek for the famous Spice Islands, under the command of Antonio de Abreu and of Francisco Cerro, which discovered Banda, Ambona, Ternate, and Tidor. During this time, Magellan had landed at the Malaysian Islands, distant 1,800 miles from Malacca, and in the archipelago of the Moluccas, he had obtained the circumstantial information which gave birth in his mind to the idea of the voyage which he was destined to accomplish later on.